Reality is so much more interesting than fiction. And I think there's a pretty obvious reason for this. Stories don't exist in a vacuum. They take inspiration from the real world, which means that oftentimes many of the most interesting or unique concepts in a story was probably already floating out there in the real world in the first place. And even though these real world elements oftentimes take on entirely new significance when compressed into the form of a finite story, these raw concepts are increasingly the things that I enjoy most about works of fiction, even before they've passed through the filter of plot, character arcs, or themes. I can't tell you how many times I've discovered some interesting new concept while reading a book that sent me down a massive Wikipedia rabbit hole, only to find out that in the real world, the concept was so much more interesting and complex than how it's presented in fiction. For example, two subjects I love a lot are history and physics. I spend a lot of time just reading random historical anecdotes, especially about the lives of ordinary people throughout history, which is what I find most interesting. And even though I was an English major in college with no math training past the high school level, I found myself unable to stop crashing physics lectures in college because I'm so interested in physics. That doesn't mean I'm good at it at all or knowledgeable about it. I'm just really interested in it. But I didn't always think this way. There was a time in my life when I didn't really care that much about nonfiction at all, when I preferred to immerse myself in fantasy and science fiction books as a way of escaping from a world that, from my perspective, was mostly kind of boring. Why would I want to learn about real history when real history doesn't have Balrogs in it? Why would I want to learn about real physics when real physics doesn't allow you to time travel or create gateways to the other side of the planet? Not to mention, there was just so much more work involved in learning about the real world than in learning about fictional worlds. I preferred it when I could just have an author take care of most of that work for me. Looking back, I think there are a few reasons I thought this way when I was young. For one thing, reality is just too complicated to learn about when you're a kid. Magic is relatively easy to understand, even when by the standards of magic, it's relatively complex. And it allows you to comprehend it in its entirety just by reading one book. There's something so satisfying and fulfilling about grasping a concept in its entirety and using that concept to make predictions about how things are going to go into the future. It's no wonder that Brandon Sanderson's magic systems have always appealed to me so much. But physics, on the other hand, seems completely different. It's oftentimes remarkably counterintuitive, and if you're not good at math, which I never have been, it's kind of hard to appreciate the beauty of it. Without the satisfaction of understanding, physics and other natural sciences just seem so burdensome, especially to someone like me who has a hard time grasping technical concepts on the first try. But simply being too young to appreciate the world wasn't my only problem. The other part of this is that in school, subjects are often taught in such a boring way that it's almost impossible to feel any excitement for them. The perfect example of this for me is history. History is now, as I said, one of my favorite subjects, but back in school I didn't care for it. And I think that's because in school, history is largely presented to kids as just a series of facts rather than a series of open historiographical questions. I didn't understand how much active research there was in history because I didn't understand that history is all about questions. I mean, the word history literally comes from the Greek historia, which means inquiry. The whole point of the field is to ask questions, and oftentimes the questions are not questions that we'll ever have complete answers to, either because the sources are missing or because they're just questions that by their very nature can't be answered, or both. This is all really exciting to me now, but as a kid I just wasn't introduced to this stuff, which means that by the time I got to high school and even college, I had a hard time grappling with the idea of asking questions about history. As an aside, I think this is partly the reason why so many adults in America still struggle with any kind of revisionism in history, because when you learn history as a series of facts, then any attempt to refine that series of facts is going to be treated as an attack on the truth rather than a refinement of it. And that's a problem, but I digress. Now, it probably sounds like I'm just bashing the entire education system here, and that's not really my goal because I don't know what a good alternative to this state of affairs is. Kids have to learn a certain foundation of facts before they can build up their knowledge of a subject to ask deep questions about it. So it seems like we're in a real pickle. How do we get students to be interested in learning about a subject if there's a massive barrier to them doing so? A barrier that literally can't be overcome without a whole lot of drudgery. Should we just start putting chips in kids' brains and downloading starter packs of information so we can skip all the boring bits and get to the interesting stuff? Well, fortunately for me, it never came to that, because my solution to this problem came in the form of books, and especially fantasy and science fiction books. Those of you who have been watching my channel for a while are probably not at all surprised to learn that I was a big reader as a kid. And if you're new here, welcome. But at a young age, I had no idea how much of an impact books would have on me. I didn't know that books would be my avenue towards overcoming this obstacle of becoming interested in the real world partly because I didn't know that problem existed, and partly because I thought the whole reason I was into fantasy and science fiction books was to escape from the real world, not to become interested in it. But looking back, it's no surprise that something like this happens, because if there's anything that stories are really good at, it's getting you to think hard about really difficult questions. It's no wonder that nonfiction couldn't hold my interest as a kid. When you compare a series of unchangeable facts to a complicated narrative with morally gray characters and interesting ethical dilemmas, how could nonfiction possibly stand to hold my interest? But what happened as I kept reading these books is that I started paying more attention to elements like the world building, the anthropology, the physics, the biology. And one thing would lead to another, so that eventually a book that I was originally just interested in for the characters and the plot, I was also just as interested in for the way it had jump-started me on a journey to learn about the sources of its inspiration. Long story short, here I am now, and I love nonfiction just as much as I love fiction. Not all nonfiction, of course. Another reason I was originally averse to nonfiction is because I had the impression that it was all self-help books, which were, filled with even more baseless conjecture than most fantasy novels. But once I overcame that hurdle and found out the nonfiction books I was interested in reading, that wasn't a problem anymore. So in the rest of this video, I'm basically just going to look at a few different examples of how different books have changed the way I think. And I'm going to describe some ways in which those books helped me develop a newfound appreciation for some aspect of the real world. I'm not always going to be focusing on the most important effect a book had on me. Indeed, in many of these cases, the most important effect has nothing to do with the topic of this video. But instead I'm going to be describing a few mostly anecdotal examples that hopefully paint a broader picture of what I'm talking about. This is all going to be kind of casual and anecdotal, but I nonetheless hope that some of you will find something interesting or enlightening in it. Also, I am going to be avoiding major spoilers for all of the books I talk about in this video, so you don't have to worry about that. Anyway, I think I've been waffling long enough. Let's just get on with the video. The Silmarillion was one of the first adult fantasy books that I really hit it off with. And yes, I said The Silmarillion, not Lord of the Rings. Even though I enjoyed Lord of the Rings when I first read it as a kid, I never really hit it off with those books in the same way that I hit it off with The Silmarillion. Maybe this is something to do with how the Lord of the Rings movies affected my perception of those books, or maybe this is just because The Silmarillion was so different from anything I'd read before. But once I really started getting into that book, and I mean really into it, some of those early chapters were hard for me to get through at first, it completely changed the way that I look at books. See, as most people know, Tolkien's books were very heavily inspired by real-world religion, mythology, and folklore. And even though that's true for Lord of the Rings, there's a certain authenticity to the Silmarillion that makes it feel very different from those books. For one thing, it's written as if it's an actual in-universe compendium of different books. For those who have never read it, the book we call the Silmarillion is actually 4 distinct texts, which are called, respectively, the Ainulin Dalle, the Valaquenta, the Quenta Silmarillion, and a text called Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. All of these books are obviously thematically related and tell an overarching story, but they're meant to have different origins in universe. A bit like another famous book, similar in nature, that Tolkien might have been a fan of. Although this meta-narrative element is very light, I do think it's essential to understanding and enjoying the book. But those 4 texts are only one piece of the puzzle here, because if you want to get the full story of Middle-earth, you have to read a whole bunch of other texts, like Unfinished Tales, the Book of Lost Tales, and of course the ever-essential The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. And as I was devouring all of these books at the time, one thing I was consistently struck by is all of the blatant contradictions. Like in the earliest version of the story of Beren and Luthien, Sauron is a giant cat. And don't even get me started on the gazillions of different versions of the story of Galadriel and Celeborn, in which Tolkien kept changing right up until the very end of his life. These contradictions can make it sometimes somewhat confusing and frustrating to get through these books, although Christopher Tolkien's excellent commentary always helps. So you might be tempted to say, well, let's just take the last version of all of these myths and say that that's the canon version. And if we want to construct a timeline of the history of Middle-earth, that's the version we'll use. Except that doesn't work. Even if you take the last version of all these stories, there's still tons of contradictions. We can assume that Tolkien would have tried to fix these contradictions if he had lived longer, but honestly, he probably would have continued to introduce new contradictions as well. That's why the series of 12 books called The History of Middle-earth are not a history of Middle-earth, the in-universe world, but are instead a history of Tolkien's attempts to create Middle-earth, which really are just as interesting. The effect of all these contradictions is that Tolkien's world feels fluid and ever-changing, and trying to piece together the history of Middle-earth is a bit like trying to piece together a puzzle. There's never just one version of a story, and even The Lord of the Rings had very interesting changes in its early drafts. This matches with the way that myths work in the real world. When I was a kid, I was always so bored by those books of Greek mythology because I would be frustrated by what seems like characters taking irrational actions or things just happening with zero explanation or context. I always thought the people who came up with these myths were just like kind of dumb or not good storytellers. What I didn't understand is that myths aren't just stories the way novels are. They have a history behind them, and that history can sometimes lead to convolutions and nonsense. In real life, there's rarely just one version of a myth, and if we try to put all the different versions together, we oftentimes end up with something that just doesn't have any internal logic to it. And so, inspired by some of these features in Tolkien's storytelling style, I was encouraged to look into some myths on my own. I read the Kalevala early on, which is the Finnish national epic that the Silmarillion took a lot of inspiration from, and there was a cow like right there. Everyone say hi to the cow. I don't know if I should keep filming. Hey, no. Come on. Hello, hi, hey, don't lick my microphone. No. Come on. He's gonna keep me hard. No. Okay, are you gonna promise not to keep eating my stuff? As I was saying before being interrupted by our bovine friend, I started to read the Kalevala, the Finnish epic that the Silmarillion takes a lot of inspiration from. And like the Silmarillion, the Kalevala is frustrating at times. The creation myth is vague and the power levels of characters are very poorly defined. It seems to break all the conventional rules of storytelling. And there's a very good reason for this. The whole point of the Kalevala was to gather together a whole bunch of disparate myths from different communities in Finland and turn these disparate stories into something that looks sort of like an epic in the sense of the Iliad or the Odyssey. But this leaves it in sort of a weird limbo where it's like halfway between the Brother Grimm tales on the one hand and the Iliad and the Odyssey on the other hand. All of which is to say that the Kalevala can't really be evaluated on any terms except its own. I think that Tolkien's approach to myth is sort of what helps me understand this. You can read a story or listen to a retelling of a myth, and that's all well and good. But understanding the way that myths evolve over time, the way that they split and merge and take on new themes and ideas, in short, looking at myths from what you might call a historical perspective, that can be just as interesting as reading the myths themselves. Of course, I should note that this historical perspective isn't the only valid way of looking at myths, and that Tolkien himself was actually a huge advocate of looking at myths from a more artistic perspective, as evidenced by some of the arguments he puts forth in essays like Beowulf, the Monsters, and the Critics. So you might say it's kind of ironic that Tolkien is the person who helps me look at myths from a more historical perspective when he's such an advocate for looking at them from an artistic perspective, and yeah, that's totally fair. But as I'll discuss later, I really do think that both of these perspectives are valuable, and just because Tolkien's books were one of my first introductions to the whole concept of myth, it was inevitable that I would learn a lot from them, regardless of whatever specific message Tolkien wanted me to take away. Either way, what I'm saying here is that Tolkien's books introduced me to a whole compendium of world literature that I never would have discovered otherwise, and for that, I can be eternally grateful. There are many things that I love about the Cosmere books, and so there are many things that I could talk about in this section. But in this part of the video, I want to focus on one particular aspect of the Cosmere books that I find very interesting, and that's Brandon Sanderson's obsession with creating a shared canon for all of his books. He isn't the first author to try to do this by any means, but I do think his approach stands out among modern fantasy authors just because of how deep the extended Cosmere lore goes. I have made other videos where I talk about the little tidbits of lore that he drops in Q&As over the years, and you can go check those out if you want to learn more. But essentially, it's abundantly clear in his books that the world we see in the books is only a small snippet of the Cosmere as a whole. All of the events in the books take place against this massive backdrop that is only just beginning to be explored in the books themselves, and until rather recently, in order to get all of the information about the connections between these different books, you had to just spend a lot of time browsing online forums and reading Q&As. And I can easily see why some people might think this is really annoying. I mean, I just made a whole section of the video talking about how much I love J.R.R. Tolkien's books specifically because they don't have a canon. And now here I am talking about loving Brandon's books for the opposite reason. But I do genuinely love this aspect of Brandon's writing for its own reason, just because there's something so almost intoxicating to me about creating an entire fictional universe with its own fixed timeline and fixed rules. I mean, there's an entire person on Brandon's staff whose job it is to just keep track of timelines. That's a full-time position at Dragonsteel, just keeping track of timelines. But as I spent all this time browsing the Coppermind and all these online forums for more good bits of lore, something interesting started to happen. I started to do the same thing with Wikipedia. See, a large part of the reason why I really loved the extended Cosmere lore is that when I was reading about some obscure religion in Mistborn or some weird plant on Roshar, I would start to flesh out this world model in my head of how this fictional universe works and operates. And I could imagine that even outside of the story of the books themselves, all of this stuff actually existed. There were whole other dimensions to this world that we only got glimpses of, and it was fun to just imagine that. So because of this mindset shift, what would happen is that when I was reading on Wikipedia about some obscure religion I'd never heard of, or some weird species of insect, or about the origins of the mutualistic relationship between dogs and humans, I would start to do the same thing. I would start to flesh out my own internal model of the world. And I would be struck by this incredible awareness that all this stuff I'm reading about actually exists. Even if I'm not aware of it, it's out there somewhere, or it was out there. All of this stuff is actually real. And so I started doing everything in my power to fill in this model of the world that I had been building. I'll never learn everything, I know that, even though I desperately want to learn everything. But the process of learning is part of the fun anyway. In a sense, what I was doing was creating a canon for myself, which is ironic because the concept of canon in fiction was inspired by reality, and now here I am creating a canon in reality inspired by the concept of canon and fiction. But regardless, as I continued to build out this canon, I started to enjoy the process more and more. In short, reading the Cosmere made me into a Wikipedia junkie. 2001: A Space Odyssey might very well be my favorite movie of all time, but I think the books are masterpieces in their own right, even though they offer something very different. For me, one of the main differences is that while Kubrick's film focuses more on the horrors of space, Clarke's novel focuses more on the wonder of it. It's the same story, and I don't think either interpretation of the story is necessarily better. The film, on the one hand, was one of the first movies I watched that made me really question what the concept of a movie was, and started me on the inevitable path to becoming a cinema fan, I guess. I don't know how to say that without sounding pretentious. But the book, on the other hand, and its sequel, awakened a totally different interest in me, and that interest was astronomy. See, there are these passages in 2001: A Space Odyssey and in its sequel, 2010: Odyssey 2, that made me think really hard about the vastness of space in a way I just never had before. And it certainly helps that these books draw a lot from real-world science. For example, 2010 was written just after the Voyager missions, which gave us our first really up-close looks at Jupiter's moons. And the book, which visits a lot of those moons, draws a lot from the data that came from those missions. I had known a little bit about these moons beforehand, but as I was reading the books, I just kept being struck by what seemed to me like this profound truth, which is that as I was reading these passages of the fiery lakes of Io or the frozen-over oceans of Europa, the places I was reading about that sounded so fantastical are places that actually exist in reality, that you could theoretically go to. See, since I've always read so much fantasy, I've always been used to reading these sorts of passages and building out an image for myself of what these places would look in my head. But when you're reading these descriptions of these distant worlds where Jupiter hangs enormously large in the sky, and jets of icy water shoot out into space, and you really internalize that these are places that actually exist, that I might have a chance to see close-up pictures of in my lifetime, that's just mind-boggling. And if the moons defy belief, then Jupiter does even more so. There's a scene in the first book where Frank and Dave send a probe into the atmosphere of Jupiter and watch a live feed as it plummets through this impossibly large atmosphere where there are clouds that look just like normal clouds, except they're the size of North America or larger. And Clarke just seems to revel in this sense of scale. Once I really internalized all of this, my interest in astronomy briefly usurped all of my other interests, and in the time since, it hasn't really dwindled so much as been temporarily surpassed by other interests, as tends to happen with me. There's just something so intoxicating about the romance of the immensity of outer space, and imagining how long it would take to travel between planets or stars, and imagining yourself standing on the surface of Titan where liquid methane flows in rivers, or on the surface of Venus where you literally can't stand because you'll just die instantly from the oppressive heat. And especially, I think there's something so incredibly beautiful about how just two relatively short books were able to spark this interest and open up a whole new world for me. So at this point, I need to confess that I don't just read books, I also write them. And there's one manuscript in particular that I have been working on off and on for several years now that has, along with all these other books I mentioned, also played a huge role in opening up new avenues of the universe for me to explore. And that's a book that's tentatively called Invention. It's a time travel story, but what I wanted to do in this book was describe what a truly fourth dimensional society would look like, a society where time travel is just as common as travel through space. I was inspired to do this because oftentimes in science fiction, time travel is more of a plot device than a feature of the world building itself, but I wanted to do something more interesting than that. And I quickly realized that in order to imagine what such a society would look like and make it more realistic than something like Gallifrey, I would have to answer a whole bunch of questions that I didn't know how to answer. Are the laws of physics deterministic? If not, and you create a new timeline every time you travel to the past, how could a society possibly function where people are constantly creating new personal timelines? What sort of government could control such a chaotic society, and how would population be distributed by time period? If you went back in time and made a duplicate of yourself, would you get to vote twice in elections? And wouldn't the Earth quickly become uninhabitable if people were constantly time traveling to the future and making duplicates of themselves and exponentially increasing the population? And eventually, after thinking about these questions for way too long, I decided that I would just need to learn as much physics as possible so I could create a society that felt realistic and interesting to me. So I picked up a few popular science books here and there on quantum mechanics and time travel and things like that, but they never really had the answers I was looking for. They all just seemed to sort of scratch the surface of the deeper questions I wanted to ask. And oftentimes, because of my lack of math background and the way they were written, I just had no idea how to distinguish between known scientific facts and pure speculation. So I started to read more complicated stuff. I read Zuskin's books on physics, and I started to read stuff by Feynman. And eventually, I was just reading actual textbooks and attending actual lectures. And it was at that point that I started to feel like I was just beginning to glimpse at the deeper truth underlying all these crazy claims I had heard scientists make for years but never been able to understand. I remember this one time when I was watching a physics lecture and something clicked in my brain suddenly, allowing me to finally understand why electron orbitals in an atom are structured in the way they are, like why there's only a certain number of electrons in each given orbital. And I have to say, as an English major with no background in this subject, finally understanding that was like such a gratifying experience. There's really nothing else quite like that. You can't get that same kind of satisfaction from the subjects that I was used to studying. And in case you actually study physics and you're just sitting here shaking your head at me, don't worry, I have no illusions about my abilities in the subject. I know I'm not good at math, and when I was learning the subject, I skipped a lot of important bits, and in the years since, I've forgotten a lot. So I couldn't talk very knowledgeably about really any of it. My point here is simply that I now have an interest in a subject that I never had an interest in before. I developed an appreciation for it, and now I am pretty much determined to learn as much of it as I can, however long it takes. I really, really want to eventually learn this subject at a deep level. But all of this was originally in the service of world building for just one book, a book that I'm not even working on anymore because it's very much on the back burner. It turned out to be way too ambitious, and I decided that it would be better for my time and sanity to take on other smaller projects in the meantime. But regardless of when or if I finish working on that book, it undeniably led me on a path to discovering these entirely new depths of reality. And for that reason, I know it's always going to have a special place in my heart. Something has changed in my brain these last few years. I used to think academics, researchers, and scientists were always so unnecessarily burdened by details, and I didn't understand why anybody would rather be like that than be like an artist. After all, us artists only have to create things that we find interesting. We don't have to painstakingly analyze heaps of data or translate ancient documents word for word. And now, even though I still think I'm more of an artistic person than a scientific person insofar as people can be split into those two categories, I think there are two distinct halves of myself now. There's the artistic half and there's the truth-seeking half. And I've learned to love all these tiny, seemingly insignificant details that make up reality, because now I understand that it's out of those details that everything that I used to think of as interesting emerge, including stories. There's an interesting poem by J.R.R. Tolkien called Mythopoeia, which on the one hand I find absolutely beautiful, but on the other hand I kind of disagree with. It's a poem written from the perspective of a character named Philomythos to a character named Mizomythos, and it represents J.R.R. Tolkien's attempts to defend myth-making as an art form in a world increasingly dominated by rationalism. In it, what he claims is that reality cannot be understood unless it's first understood through the lens of myth. saying, for instance, "He sees no stars who does not see them first, a silver lining made that sudden burst of flame like flowers beneath an ancient song, whose very echo after music long has since pursued. There is no firmament, only a void unless a jeweled tent myth woven in elf patterned, and no earth unless the mother's womb whence all have birth." On the one hand, I really appreciate the overall sentiment of this poem. World building is easily one of my favorite hobbies, and I do think there is something noble in the act of secondary creation, as Tolkien called it. For me, it's one of the most fulfilling things I can do. But on the other hand, I do think Tolkien is at least somewhat mistaken in saying that reality can only be understood through the lens of myth. Myths are these wonderful things that really can add meaning to an otherwise meaningless universe, but I no longer think they're inherently more interesting than reality. What's interesting to me are minds, and Tolkien is right in saying that minds are the only things in the universe capable of creating myths, but minds are also the only thing in the universe capable of understanding the universe. And I think that these are both noble endeavors. "You look at trees and label them just so, for trees are trees and growing is to grow. You walk the earth and tread with solemn pace one of the many minor globes of space. A star's a star, some matter in a ball compelled to courses mathematical, amid the regimented cold inane where destined atoms are each moment slain." Beauty is subjective. I can easily understand why some people would say that something like Dirac's equation is less beautiful than, say, the Norse creation myth, but for my part, I like both. Why shouldn't the real physical nature of stars as compressed balls of hydrogen held together by hydrostatic equilibrium be equally as beautiful as myths about stars? Indeed, the reality of what a star actually is so much more shocking than any of our myths about it. In myths, a star is something like a person, but in reality, it's something so incomprehensibly vast and alien that even all of our analogies fall into meaninglessness before it. We know, for instance, that 1,300,000 Earths can fit into the sun, but the shocking nature of this fact can't impress us as much as it should, no matter how much we think about it. We can't imagine something that big. Our brains can't model reality in all of its complexity. All we can do is scratch the surface and marvel at wonder that's forever beyond our reach. I really do think Mythopoeia is a beautiful poem, and as I've said many times before, I love J.R.R. Tolkien's works as a whole. But I want to push back at least a little bit against this narrative that myth is inherently more interesting than reality. After all, why can't we have both? It's not like rationality is going to make us into emotionless computers. A computer may be able to understand the magnitude of a star, but it can never marvel at it. Only we can do both. I'm no scientist, I'm no academic, and really the only thing I'm somewhat good at is telling stories, which makes it tempting sometimes to put myself on a pedestal and say, well, telling stories must be the most noble thing in the universe. It must be the most noble thing there is to do. But I don't think that's the case. I think the real world is beautiful in its own way, even if it's more difficult to appreciate than it might be to appreciate a good book. Maybe this particular path to learning about history and science won't apply to everyone, but it's what worked for me. And now I revel in the complexity of the world. I've learned to find joy in minutiae. Thank you all so much for watching. I've wanted to make a video like this for a while, but I just wasn't sure the best way to go about it. If you're new here after that one recent world building video blew up, then thank you so much for checking out the rest of my channel, and I have plenty more videos about fantasy, science fiction, and world building coming up in the future, so stay tuned for those. And if you're a returning viewer, thank you so much for sticking around. Either way, thanks for watching, and have a great day, everyone.